The first speaker is Charlie Gammell, who is an independent scholar working on cultural heritage projects in Afghanistan. He has also published a book on Herat titled The Pearl of Khorasan, A History of Herat, 2016, in addition to several articles on Iran and Afghanistan. And his talk today is about Herat in the Qajar era.
Thank you very much. And before I start, I'd just like to echo everyone else's thanks to the organisers of the conference and say what a privilege it is to be here amongst such distinguished academics, and I'm sure there'll be some very good questions later. So today I'm going to talk about Herat during the 19th century and questions, as I think it said, questions of identity. To whom was Herat loyal? Was it a Qajar? Was it the eastern edge of the Qajar Empire, or was it the western edge of an Afghan Sadrzaya Empire? And what did the British really think of it? And I think I'm going to start with discussing some themes about Herat's history and why I think these themes in Herat's history are important. And I think I'll just start with in 1863, Nasruddin Shah was asked about the city of Herat by Austrian traveller Vanbury, not long lost to the Pashtun ruler Dost Muhammad Khan. And Nasruddin Shah said, "I have no taste for such ruined cities." And yet, when you look at Nasruddin Shah's writings on Herat in the lead up to its fall in 1863, you get this sense that there's a sort of elegiac lament for the loss of Herat. And I think Nasruddin Shah's comments on the fall of Herat, his interest in the day-to-day goings-on in Herat, whether it's appointing an ulama in a mosque, or whether commenting on an Afghan delegation that came to Tehran, shows a real keen interest in the city. And I think if you contrast that to Abdurrahman Khan in the late 19th century, who was an Afghan ruler, Abdurrahman Khan wasn't as interested in Herat historically as Nasruddin Shah was. And I think when reading the sources from Abdurrahman Khan about his views on Herat, it reminds me of trying to get my 2-year-old to stop watching Peppa Pig. There's not really that much interest from Abdurrahman Khan, and actually it was in his interest to outsource the defence of the west of Afghanistan to Imperial Britain. So I think I'd like to just talk about some themes that are common throughout Herat's history and why they play an important part in its identity as this, I think, uniquely misunderstood city over the years. Culture, wit and intellectual sophistication. Herat is a Persian city of Jami, Behzad, Ansari and poets such as Qasima Anvar and the Herati school. This is, we think of the Timurid Kitab Khaneh, we think of the Behzad Shahnamehs, we think of this great flowering of Persian poetry in the Timurid century. This really left a mark on Persian consciousness. And in 1544, Babur Mirza Humayun fled to then Safavid Herat and was treated to this extraordinary reception by the Safavids, which echoed Timurid courtly sophistication, Timurid rituals. And so again, there's this idea that the Timurid century obviously feeds into Safavid's conception of itself as the sort of Persian cultural hegemon of the region. And even Herat's role in the Safavid time, this again feeds into the way the Qajars saw it. Shah Abbas, it was the place where Shah Abbas did his tutelage growing up, and in fact Shah Abbas was even in 1581 crowned there as emperor when Shah Ismail II died. By Ali Quli Khan, one of the Lalas. So here's this idea that Herat is forming this eastern edge of a Persian empire. And it's interesting that Herat, briefly in 1581, after having been a Timurid imperial capital, became the Safavid imperial capital, though not for very long. And that cultural element is important today. When Heratis talk about Pashtuns, and particularly this is obviously important that now the Taliban are back in power, when Heratis talk about Pashtuns, they're very, very disdainful of them as these sort of, they call them donkeys, and they don't know, Persian poetry, and they're not very sophisticated. And so this feeds into Herat's identity as a Persian city of sophistication and wit. I think the next thing that I think is important is fertility. the fertility of the Hari-Rud oasis. And practically what does that mean? That means that Herat is a very rich oasis town, and it has often held out the promise to empires from far and wide that it can be something, it can raise money, you can land an army there, and it has this sort of practical significance that relates to its fertility. And I think from Herodotus calling it the breadbasket of Asia to 19th century travelogues talking about the sweetness of Herat's water, and there's a great Beheshti Heravi, who's a 16th century, 17th century Persian poet. He sort of rhapsodizes about the pureness and the sweetness of Herat's water. And again, we talk about the practical terms when we come to the 19th century. The British were very worried that the Russians would use Herat's fertility as a place to land an army as a staging post into going into India in the context of the Great Game. So this fecundity and fertility of Herat is very important for its self-image and how it sees itself. I remember going into different Karoch and Obey and all these districts around Herat, and people would tell you that the different bits of the different varieties of grapes they've got, the different varieties of figs they've got, and that is really an important part of the way Herat sees itself and also the way the world sees it. Religion, Herat is predominantly a Sunni city with a great tradition of Sufis, Naqshbandi and other Chishti and other Sufi orders throughout Herat. Herat's Sufi peers had long played important political mediating roles between invading armies and Herati rulers going all the way back to the Mongols and before. And again, one of the earliest uprisings against the Qajar rule was couched in highly sectarian terms. This was the Bukharan Sufi mystic Sufi Islam, who was a dyer, actually resident in Herat, who rose up with pretty calamitous consequences for him against Qajar authority in the early 19th century. So Herat is a Persian Sunni city, and I think that is a really important thing to bear in mind in the context of the 19th century, when this sort of Persianate Sunni identity is facing off against the Persianate Shia identity with the Qajars, and that tension I think is important. It's important in terms of legitimation and the way these conflicts in the 19th century were I suppose, presented, but I think we can overstate that importance. So the big shrine in Herat to Abdullah Ansari at Gazargah was repeatedly desecrated by Qajar sources coming in during the 19th century. And again, this is an indication of some of the sectarian forces that were at play in this conflict. And this obviously began when Herat became, from 1510 onwards, when Herat became a Safavid city. That was when the imprimatur of a Shia identity and the settling of Shia Qizilbash troops and administrators in Herat, that was when that begun. And I think this begins the tension between Herat as a Persian city of this cultural heritage, which the Safavids consciously aped. And I do think that Shah Abbas's time, or Abbas Mirza's time in Herat, when he was a Lala, what he would have seen of the Timurid architecture, what he would have seen of all the sort of Timurid buildings that were there, that I think informed the way Safavid Isfahan developed. And interestingly, in the 19th century, there was Dost Muhammad Khan in sort of reflecting this sectarian element. He had a canon forged called the Char Yari, relating to the four caliphs, and then in Herat they had one slightly bigger, which was called the Panj Tani, in commemoration of five leading, obviously, figures in Shia Islam. I think another thing which is really important is geography. Herat's centre of the Timurid Empire, although paradigmatic in terms of the way Herat sees itself, I think this was an exception to the norm whereby power converged on Herat and didn't radiate from within its walls out into the surrounding territories. The upheavals of the early Ilkhanid years and these messy post-Timurid centuries that before we get into the 19th century prove that Herat sits at the edge of different geographies, the eastern outpost of a Persian empire and the western edge of an Afghan or even an Uzbek polity. And in 1588, when Herat fell to the Uzbeks, a contributing factor to the fall was the Safavid inability to send reinforcements from Mashhad to Herat. And again, in the lead up to 1838, to the first siege of Herat, it was incumbent on the Qajars to send out sort of intelligence gathering scouts into what was Eastern Khorasan for them, because they didn't quite understand what was going on there. And again, this picks up on this tension that The Qajars felt that this was theirs by dint of the Safavid legacy that they were trying to ape, but it was also practically a little bit far away from their ability to control it. And this is the theme actually throughout history, I think throughout Herat's history, where you have imperial capitals misunderstanding Herat. Imperial capitals unable, they're both attracted by the fertility, the fecundity, the intellectual excellence of Herat, but they're also, it's very difficult to control. So you have these, like you had under the Ilkhanids after the Mongols, the Khatid, the first sort of Herati dynasty post Genghis Khan. This was a sort of a client state that which the Ilkhanids always struggled to control fully, and the deaths of Danishmand Bahadur and Amir Chupan in Herat are indicative of Herat's, the difficulty that people had in controlling Herat. People wanted it, but because it was far from the sort of traditional imperial capitals of the region, it was quite difficult to hold. And this is an important theme in the 19th century, when Herat, if anything, is this sort of Sadazai Pashtun enclave that's trying to play off different sides against each other. Empires have lacked for knowledge of what's going on in Herat, and even up to the late 20th century in 1979, when Herat rose up against the Afghan communist rule in the Qiyam-e Bistashar-e-Hut, Politburo transcripts of conversations between Kabul and Moscow indicate quite clearly that neither side actually knew what was going on in Herat. Kabul thought that Herat was absolutely, totally in the pay of Iran, which wasn't the case. The Qiyam-e Bistashar-e-Hut was a local uprising driven by Afghan issues. And Moscow bizarrely thought that Herat was in the pay of China, which is obviously wrong as well. And I think this is a feature, this misunderstanding is also a feature of the 19th century, where you have voluminous accounts from British imperial strategists talking about Herat as the gate to India. This assumption that as soon as Herat fell, this Russian army would march straight through into British India and take British India, seemingly unaware of how difficult it was for British imperial armies to have an army in Afghanistan and beat the Afghans and then secure it for themselves. And I think reading this, and having been a diplomat and done sort of geopolitical strategizing of myself, it's amazing how damaging groupthink is. So what? I think in Herat you have a streak of independence that's driven by fertility of the Harirud Oasis, the cultural excellence of its sort of courtly traditions, the strength of its fort, and its geographical position at sometimes the edge of these competing empires. So I'm going to talk a little bit now, and those are the themes that I think that are important and that drive some of the 19th century and what's going on, what we're going to be talking about with the Qajars. So after the regicide of Nader Shah Afshar, Ahmed Khan was given a coronation as Ahmad Shah Durrani in Kandahar with a sheaf of barley, which still or did form part of the Afghan flag. And the Pashtun chiefs, when they came in, stated their intention to seek their own nation and independence from Shia Persian sovereignty. So already in the late 18th century, you have this stated Pashtun intention to seek independence from Shia Persian sovereignty. And early Pashtuns who had settled in Herat, that is what caused this. The Sadazais, that is what caused Ahmad Shah Durrani's gaze to flip that way. This wasn't a natural sort of hunting ground, I suppose, or geography for Pashtuns, but the Sadazai Pashtuns who settled in Herat around the same time that Shah Abbas was in Isfahan, who were sort of mercenaries and horse traders, those are the people to whom Ahmad Shah Durrani is looking to expand to the east. And as I said, the Pashtuns' natural inclination was to look east. But I think the Sadazai lineage that Ahmad Shah shared meant for him that Herat would always mark the western edge of a Sadazai empire. And then his capture of Herat in 1750 sort of set the seal on this and began Herat's, I suppose, the official presence in Herat of Sadazais as ruling elite. And Ahmed Siraj al-Tawarikh says, Ahmad Shah, bearing in mind that whoever became ruler of Iran would find Khorasan a barrier between Afghanistan and Iran, undertook to guarantee the independence of Khorasan. So in the Pashtun mind, Herat becomes a buffer. Herat isn't this inalienable cultural stronghold that it is for the Persians. It's a buffer to the Iranian state coming east into Kandahar. And I think throughout, having said that, in the early exchanges between Herat's Sadazai rulers and the Qajars, the Sadrzai rulers thought very clearly, we've taken Herat by dint of arms, and we've taken Herat by sort of through our military prowess, and they looked down on the Qajar's sort of revanchist Safavid project. And yet, despite this, they were happy that a feature of the Sadrzai relationship with the Qajars was that they were happy to pay lip service to Qajar sovereignty through khutbah and sikha if this meant that they could get protection from the Sadrzai, from the Qajars. And why did they want this? They wanted this because the Durrani Empire, over the course of its time, was prone to splitting, and it was prone to intrafamilial splits that separated Herat from Kandahar and Kabul. Qajar Herat, in the conquest of 1796 of Mashhad by Agha Muhammad Khan, heralded a revival of Qajar dominance into eastern Khorasan. And early diplomatic exchanges between the Qajar and the Sadrzai representatives suggest that Safavid rule by proxy over Herat might be a possibility. And in 1800, a Herati diplomat headed to the Qajar court to discuss this age-old issue of Herat's allegiance. And again, the Sadrzai claims basically rested on their sort of force majeure. We own Herat, and we think that it should. That's how it should stay. And the Qajar counterclaims again reach back into the Safavid past to establish this imagined sovereignty over Herat. And in the lead up, as I said, in the lead up to this imagined sovereignty, in the lead up to the 1837 siege, the Qajars were forced to sending missions into Khorasan to find out exactly what's going on. But the Qajar claims over Herat weren't just fictitious, they were also a desire, and you see this throughout Qajar Firmans, a desire to protect Shia co-religionists in Khorasan from Turkoman slavers, and a slightly paternalistic view of the security of Herat. And that was obviously based on their desire to control a very fertile and profitable province, but it was also based on a heartfelt desire to protect that region from the slave trade. And you have lots of commentators who go to, lots of visitors who go to Herat in the 19th century comment on the slave trade, of which the Sadrzai Pashtuns were an enthusiastic player. So I think it's Pottinger, when he's in Herat in 1838, says, "It was hardly safe for a stranger to be abroad after sunset. Unless protected by an armed escort, there was too great a likelihood of being seized and sold into slavery." And I think, and British Herat, and then we come to why Britain thought that Herat had to be kept according to its designs. Obviously, the Great Game is something I'm not going to go into in great detail here, but Britain felt that Herat was the key to India, and if Herat fell, Russian armies, as I've said, would march all the way to British India. I think it is important to state that the Great Game didn't just start as a fear of Russia; it started actually as a fear of French advances in the region. So, and actually the role of French advisors to Qajar courts in the siege of 1838 and beyond, that is an important role that French engineers and French military strategists played alongside Russians as well. And again, throughout the 19th century, Britain, right up until the early 20th century, Britain is still obsessing over Herat's loyalty, obsessing over Herat's which way it's going to turn, seemingly unaware of the events that had taken place in the 19th century, which showed Afghanistan a very difficult country to bend to your will. And in 1830, the British fear of Russian advances into India via Herat had gained new momentum, helped along by Russian-Persian alliances and the concomitant Russophobia in India. Russian military successes in the Caucasus and the humiliating treatment, obviously, of Turkmenchai, which effectively rendered Persia, as someone said, delivered bound hand and foot to the court of St. Petersburg, forced the Qajars to look to Khorasan with the encouragement of Russia and to Herat in pursuit of their Safavid legacy, now that the Caucasus was in Russian hands. And then you have, obviously, alongside you have Sir John Malcolm ringing the alarm bells about Russian attacks on Herat, Russian designs on Herat and Qajar designs on Herat. And by the 1832, the Qajars had launched a series of attacks on Khorasan, ostensibly to curb the trade in slaves, as I've said. but I think also you had this, against the backdrop of that, even though you had tensions between Yar Muhammad Khan, who was the vizier, Prince Kamran Sadazai's vizier in Herat, and the Qajars in Tehran. The Qajars felt that Herat was not doing enough to curb the slave trade, and obviously Yar Muhammad Khan felt that this was a lucrative business. And there's a nice description from Siraj Tawarikh about a Qajar minister explaining to Yar Muhammad Khan the region's history and the power dynamics in a slightly condescending terms. In olden days, Afghanistan was part of Iran, but following the assassination of Nader Shah, Ahmad Shah Sadazai established an independent regime there. Up to now, Herat has been in Sadazai hands, presently Prince Kamran's, but the rest of the kingdom is under control of the son of Sardar Payandar Khan. The prince therefore ought to vacate Herat and come to the Shah of Iran. Or he should have the khutbah read and the coinage minted in the name of the Shah of Iran, and should collect and send the revenues agreed on by treaty, and also send his son as bond. He would thereby attain peace of mind, otherwise we will take Herat by force. And that's a really nice summation of what the Qajars thought, and it's actually quite a nice indication of the flexibility of the Qajar approach, which was fealty, revenues, or khutbah. You can have this sort of the veneer of fealty through khutbah and sikha. And the British obviously are getting increasingly terrified at this, so they send, as they do, they send Mohan Lal, who was a British India Office officer, into Herat to try and shore up relations with Kamran. And obviously Lal's team sought assurances from Kamran Shah that Herat would remain neutral in the face of Persian pressure. And interestingly, on this trip, Mohan Lal, this is sort of the start of Britain's real obsession with Herat. Lal sent out to inspect the city's defences and concluded pretty negatively about the quality of Herat's defences and about the quality of the city itself, which again is ironic given the basis on which the British based their sense that Herat was the key to India, on the strength of the citadel, the fertility of the oasis. So even there you have a sort of a nascent contradiction in the way Britain was thinking and the way it was reporting it. And so Lal was trying to get from Kamran Shah assurances of his independence. And I mean, obviously the accounts that Mohan Lal writes about his audience with Kamran Shah are amusing, and I think it points to the sort of, I suppose, relative decrepitude of Herat's court relative to the heights of the Timurid and Safavid times. And there's one very bizarre detail where during one of the audiences with Kamran Shah, Kamran puts a goldfish bowl with 3 goldfish between the two of them as they're talking, and I have no idea why he would have done that. And I think Kamran, during these meetings with Mohan Lal, professed that he was totally loyal to his friendship to the British, that he was neither a friend to the Persians nor a friend to the Russians. And I think this is a subtle contradiction of Kamran's long-standing ties to the Qajar court, which he manifested in khutbah and sikha and khutbah. And I think it's easy to present Kamran Shah's actions or his words as perfidious. And again, this word perfidious was a word that the Ilkhanids used about the carps the whole time. They look one way, they look the other, and they tell you one thing and they do another thing. And I think we have to understand that this sort of streak of independence, this streak of opportunism within Herat is born of geography. It's born of the threats that they thought that they had from the Qajars and the threats that they had from their sort of Pashtun cousins, I suppose, in Kandahar and Kabul. So this is Herat playing its role as a city, as a province that's menaced on a few sides by different competing powers, and has to tread a very fine line between meeting these pressures. And I think Mohan Lal even he noted this. He said, being afraid of the Persian government, Kamran is very anxious to make an alliance with the English power, and is extremely afraid of his ministers, the family of Yar Muhammad. So even his own ministers he has some fear of, and never dares to feed his horse without their sanction. So by offering the outward symbols of loyalty to Tehran, Kamran could largely avoid military conflict with Persia, but then he could also profess loyalty to Britain. So this is again, these are the sort of contradictions and confusions that have had political strategists over the years scratching their heads. And again, you know, the 21st century observers of Herat, I mean, I remember working in Afghanistan at the time, and you would speak to people in Kabul who would say, well, you know, the Heratis, they're very close to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and then you'd speak to the Iranians and say, well, actually, the Heratis are far too close to Kabul, and you'd speak to the Heratis and say, well, we're actually Afghan, and we're very proud of the fact that we're part of an Afghan nation. So I think this is a theme that runs through Herat's history. And then I think the siege itself is obviously, much like a lot of these sieges, it dragged on, and it was very gruesome and very grim. And there's a nice line from Riazi Hadavi, who's a Shia Afghan chronicler, who says, "O gardener, when you expel the birds from the garden, spare the nests of the nightingales which long made their home within." And that was a sort of a plea to the Qajars not to destroy as much as they did. And obviously the siege, as we all know, the siege of Herat was lifted by British naval pressures on the south of Iran. But I think the conversations that were had during 1838, 1837 was a year of lots of fighting, and then 1838 there's diplomatic exchanges going back and forth. The Qajar demands remain the same. Herat and Yar Muhammad Khan desist from plundering trade and pilgrim routes into Persian Khorasan. Obviously the remaining Persian and Shia prisoners within the citadel weren't executed, and Kamran's status changed from Shah or Prince to Mirza. Kamran himself demanded to be on equal footing with the Qajars of Baradar, and that Herat remain politically independent, that the Qajars desist from sending troops to Herat, and that the Qajars desist from the notion of installing a Qajar garrison within the walls of Herat. And I think that's it. How long have I got? What is?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. That was the tenor of the negotiations that were going back and forth about how each side saw Herat, and then you had the sort of negotiation between the Qajars and the British, and then there's a very pithy letter from McNeill to the Qajar court saying, "It is stated that in histories and maps Herat is described and laid down as belonging to the territory of Persia. The statement is correct, but Georgia, Shuki, Evran, Karabagh, and even Mosul and Baghdad have also been numbered amongst the hereditary dominions of Persia. But these places are now in the possession of others and no longer belong to the Persian government." And when you read some of the heartfelt Qajar accounts of the time, you can see that must have stung. And that must have hit on a sore point in the Qajar psyche. When we fast forward to 1857 and the Treaty of Persia, by which the Qajars formally were pressured into, very similar to 1838, with naval pressure, the Qajars were pressured into renouncing their sovereignty of Herat. Interestingly, after 1857, where the Qajars agreed not to interfere with the affairs of Herat, up until 1863, when Dost Muhammad Khan took Herat for the sort of Pashtun Afghanistan, Khutbah and Sikha was still being said in the name of the Qajars in Iran up until 1863. And again, I think this is a really interesting point, that even though 1857 marked this sort of official end of Qajar Herat's role, or to Qajar role in Herat, the reality of this still persisted. So the Sadazais in Herat were happy to receive the sort of protection from the Qajars because they felt menaced by what was going on to the east of them in Kandahar and Kabul. And concluding thoughts, I think, what was Herat for the British? I don't think that Herat for the British was the gateway to India. I think events prove very conclusively that holding Herat was very difficult. Marching an army through Kandahar, Kabul, and then on into British India was almost impossible, as the British tried 2 times. And no matter how fertile the Harirud oasis, Herat wasn't the key to India. And I think that there are even some nice early 20th century accounts from British diplomats where they sort of slowly come into the realization that this is the case. And there's a great sort of an open letter from a Persian diplomat to Henry Rawlinson in 1880, where they lay out very conclusively why the folly of Britain's policy, sort of saying, why do you think that Herat in the hands of the Pashtuns will be any safer than Herat in the hands of the Persians? and asking these questions that actually are logically quite difficult to understand. What was Herat for the Afghans? Herat's place in Afghanistan is a very complicated one. Dost Muhammad Khan died in Herat in 1863. He's buried in Herat. During the Afghan-Soviet War, the Herat experienced the most number of casualties. I think it was the second largest number of casualties per year. It played a hugely important role in fighting the Soviets. And yet, after the Afghan Boundary Commission in 1888 sort of drew the lines, as Charles was talking about, drew the lines that sort of sealed Herat off from Iran, it falls away from view. And it ceases to be an important part in the minds of many Afghan historians of Afghanistan's history. And I think that's a really, and obviously I talk about it in my book and I'm doing more work on it now. That is a really important, how did Herat, a city which has played such an important part in Afghanistan, how did it fall away so conclusively? My sense is that the Afghan nation that came into being after 1863 was a predominantly and a self-consciously Pashtun one in which it was difficult for a city like Herat with its Timurid legacy and its legacy of culture and sort of very self-consciously Persianate culture, it was a difficult place for Herat to fit into the Afghan notion of a nation. Also, geography. Herat is far from Kabul, and it felt very cut off. If you read 1930s accounts of Herat in the context of Afghanistan, you get the sense of a city apart, a city stuck on the edge of the sort of western edge of an Afghan nation. I think if anyone had a claim over Herat, it was Persia. It's a city of Behzad, Jami, as I've said. It feeds directly into Persia's self-image, the image of the Qajars, the image of the Safavids, given the importance that the sort of Timurid identity plays culturally in Iran. And yet you have these ideas of geography which made it very difficult for Herat to be anything other than a fiction of Qajar Persia.
The next speaker is Sabri Atesh, who is an associate professor at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. He has written, his first book was on the Young Turk Tunalı Hilmi Bey, and to those of us who study Iran, he is well known as the author of one of the best books on Iranian-Ottoman relations that I know of, Ottoman-Iranian Borderlands Making a Boundary, Cambridge 2030. Professor Atesh, where is he? Oh, you're already there? Okay, come on here. Very good.
All right. I guess it's my luck to be the last speaker. I first of all want to thank the conveners, and I think I should thank Professor Melville for giving me the task of giving a talk about the transformation of Ottoman-Iranian borderlands. So it's only 400 years. And I'm hoping to summarize it in 4 to 5 minutes to follow on what Dr. Abdullah said. So the question of frontiers has been central to Ottoman history. For almost 100 years, the discussions about the frontier will come and go, but they were central to the Ottoman historiography. But this was the Western frontiers. The Eastern frontiers with Iran, did not receive as much attention until very recently. Now we have a good literature actually forming about this frontier. But it is no exaggeration to suggest that the boundary that divides modern states of Iran, Iraq, and Turkey played an equally consequential role in shaping the nature of the Ottoman, and of course Safavid and successor states and their imperial ideologies. This boundary, one of the longest in the making and perhaps oldest among Muslim countries, underwent 4 centuries evolution to reach its final form. If we start the history of this boundary with Chaldiran in 1514, exactly 400 years later, couple days after the First World War started, the last commission actually ended on this boundary. So, in the words of Owen Lattimore, this frontier functioned as an ancient interacting frontier, and it was not a sudden one. Its final shape is a product of the long history of the Ottoman-Iranian confrontations and negotiations, the agency and resilience of various borderland peoples and their struggles to preserve their habitats, and lastly, the great power intervention. It is also a product of the larger process of territorialization of sovereignty and the transition from suzerain to sovereign relations, marked by the transformation of peripheral governance from indirect to direct rule. Now, as Bernard Brodel says, when looking at the Mediterranean boundaries, frontiers, he says we should imagine hundreds of different types of frontiers. So instead of going over hundreds of frontiers between Iran and the Ottoman Empire, I will limit myself to 3 of them. First, religio-ideological, then geopolitical, and the medical frontier. I would approach this from the perspective of an Ottoman historian. I feel good to say this in front of so many Iranian scholars. It makes my life easier. But I will have, of course, inherent biases associated with this viewpoint. So my paper will be mostly based on Ottoman chronicles and Ottoman understanding of this border. Now, the 2 types of frontier, the religio-ideological and geopolitical, actually evolved in relation to one another. But it also changed in regard to developments elsewhere, especially in Europe. However, the developments surrounding the 3rd one, that is the medical, accelerated transformation of this borderland into a more defined boundary. So therefore, I will conclude my discussion with the regulation of a specific cross-border movement, namely the transport of dead Shia bodies for burial in Ottoman Iraq, and the outbreak of cholera, how they became instrumental actually in finalizing this border. So by highlighting this rather peculiar border crossing, I aim to show how it helped regularize the crossing of the living bodies across the frontiers. Now, the struggles for this border region, for hegemony over Mesopotamian plains and the Zagros Mountains, goes back to the ancient history. But in the 16th century, it became the scene of wars between the Safavid and Ottomans. Now, one of the questions I ask, as we are in the Idea of Iran seminar, what Iran meant for the Ottomans. And the basic question I'm asking was Iran Dar al-Harb, or was Iran Dar al-Islam? If it is Dar al-Harb, what it means, what are the repercussions? If it's Dar al-Islam, what are the repercussions? And then the other side of the question, how did Iran became actually Ottomans accepted it as Dar al-Shia? Right? So this, when you look at the frontier, you can actually follow this transformation. Now, how it started, of course, the Ottoman-Safavid encounters starts very early on. It starts with Sheikh Junayd coming to Anatolia. Ottomans actually send him money. They are very suspicious of him. And he spends that money on copying the works of Ibn al-Arabi, which become very important, actually, in shaping the Safavid ideas about kingship and about Insan al-Kamil, and Shah has Insan al-Kamil. So, that note aside, so the relations go back there. And Ottomans will actually send monies to Ardabil called Charag Akçesi. We can follow from in Amat registers, or the gift register of the Ottomans. But when Shah Ismail comes to power, things change. And the reason things change is because it was a revolution. And it has a lot of appeal in Anatolia. So Ottomans basically faced the prospect of losing Anatolia to this revolution. Now, what happens here, Ottoman ideology about Iran starts shaping. And in almost all Ottoman chronicles, when you look, Iran is seen as a land that used to be Sunni and lost to some heretics. So we have to get this vilayeti Iran, as they call it, which is kind of rather disparagingly. They don't call it as a separate country, but it's this vilayet that the Shah-e Gomrah, this is the expression that Ottoman chronicles use, right? This Gomrah actually taken under control, we have to bring it to straight path. Why? Because Sheikh Safi was a Sunni sheikh. So this is kind of at the basic, how Ottoman ideas about Safavid Iran start shaping, right? It was ours, we gotta get it back. Now, when this started, of course, with Selim I, right? The guy who carried out Chaldiran, he actually convinced a council of ulama and tasked them to come up with a fatwa or solutions to how to wage war against Iran. Because in Islam, it is rather problematic, a Muslim state waging war on another Muslim state. So how are you going to do this, right? And in the meantime, of course, Safavid revolutionary activity is going on in Anatolia, and you have to find a solution. So what they did is basically come up with fatwas, and the council ended, the mufti of the time publishes the fatwa. And Ottomans will declare jihad on the Safavids on the grounds of suppressing innovations and punishing the leaders of secession from faith. From 1512 onward, Ottoman religious authorities start issuing those anti-Shia and anti-Qizilbash, I think we should call them, fatwas, warning Muslims, and I quote this, warning Muslims to be aware of them, declaring them to be worse than infidels. And one of the very famous Ottoman Sheikh al-Islam and historian, Kemal Pasha, that says, they are worse than Harbi kafirs. Harbi is like kind of the real kafirs, right? Those are worse than them. Because they are kafir and mulhid. They're not only kafirs, but they're also mulhid, apostates. So it is permissible and even incumbent upon Muslims to kill their men, divide their goods, women and children, and any of the Guzat or Ghazis who dies in this pursuit will be declared a martyr, a shaheed. Right? So this is the conceptual kind of ideological framework that how the Ottomans saw Iran. Now this idea reached kind of its crescendo during the time of Suleiman the Magnificent. Now what is really interesting about the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, you have one of the famous Shaykh al-Islam, Abu Saud, who kind of combines Ottoman law with Sharia. At the same time, in Iran, you have Al-Karakim doing kind of the opposite. So what happens, Suleiman wants to carry out campaigns, and I think they are very much informed by religious ideology. He carries out 4 campaigns towards Safavid Iran, none of them very successful because Shah Tahmasp actually turns them into hollow victories. And the last one that Suleiman actually carries in 1553 against Iran is actually to force Iran, to force Tahmasp to have peace with him, rather than defeat him. So, in the fatwas of the time of Suleiman, the Ottoman ulama put the Qizilbash in 3 categories. They are kafir or kuffar, unbelievers. They are baghi, they rebel, because Ottomans, at least ideologically, saw Iran as kind of our land that we have to return to the fold of Sunni Islam, right? So the Safavids are rebels. But they're also murtad, they're apostates, they're also Rafizi, they are rejectors, and they are mulhid, they are deviators. Now the question is, when you categorize somebody like this, how are you going to have borders with them? Because there are 2 borders, right? One, you have to have the sectarian boundary, the boundaries between, even though there is no land that you can say Shiism starts here and Sunnism ends here, but you still have to find a boundary. The other is the geopolitical boundary. And the question is how those 2 will form each other. Now, Ottomans are not alone, of course. As this is happening in Iran, you have intense anti-Sunni activities during the time of Shah Tahmasp. And Al-Amara gives some very interesting examples of during the time of Shah Tahmasp, which we don't have to go into. But this is what is going on. So So this exacerbation of the sectarian hostility or increasing the visible religio-ideological frontier makes both states to have a boundary. And this boundary will come after those campaigns in 1553. And how it happened is one of the very wonderful Ottoman chronicles, Beyan-i Menazzil-i Seferi Iraqain by Matrakçı Nasuh, he says, and he uses this word, he says, it became obvious that Shahmat is not possible. So another strategy was necessary. And the strategy is, after, of course, a lot of writing, slanderous letters, some of them actually not as slanderous as the others, they finally signed a treaty in 1555 called the Amasya Treaty. Now, what is interesting about this, Ottomans were forced to accept Safavid Iran as a legitimate entity. And that is a very important turning point conceptually also. So, so when you look at the communication between the parties, you see that there are two negotiations going on. One is about the sectarian boundary. The other is about the real geopolitical boundary. And both required a clear definition. Now what happened after the treaty? Ottomans said, okay, we will accept the Iranians going to Hajj, going to Atabat, but we are also going to stop cursing the first three caliphs, because this is always, one of the ways I try to look at Ottoman-Iranian relations is, you know, we can go all about sectarianism, about religion, about this and that. I want to look at their treaties and to see what were they discussing when they came together. What were the terms of engagement? And you see religion always, at least symbolically, comes first, and then other things were discussed, right? So the treaty divided Georgia between them and granted Ottomans Iraq, or most of it, parts of Kurdistan, Western Armenia, and Iran received Tabriz, Yerevan, and Nakhchivan. Now, with this treaty, the regimes of border crossing and rules regarding it emerged as one of the most critical components of Ottoman-Iran relations. Now, this border crossing has always been, in my understanding, one of the main issues between Iran and the Ottoman Empire. Because when the Safavid agents were coming to Anatolia, Anatolian masses going to Shah Ismail, the idea of marking a border where Safavid revolution will stop emerged as the most important point for the Ottomans. So you have to have a boundary, and it finally, after 50 years of devastating wars, and you can only imagine how the borderland communities actually were suffering in those wars. Ottomans carrying out campaign, Shah Tahmasp coming and burning everything down, and for 50 years it was one of the most devastating periods for the people of the region, if not for the empires themselves. Now, what happens also with this Treaty of Amasya, Iran is now accepted as part of the land of Islam. Because Suleiman says holy places were open to all Muslims now. Right? So Iran starts transforming into at least a vague Dar al-Islam rather than Dar al-Harb. And this I call it secularization. But by secularization I mean a relation that is not based on confessional identities, but on interstate relations that are based on treaties. Not in the secular laicite. I'm not using it as laicite. Now, Suleiman reminds the Shah the essence of treaty was about frontiers. And the word he used is hudud, do memleket ve serhadi vilayet. So you see that this is the essence of the treaty. Where are our frontiers? How are we going to know where the Ottoman Empire ends, Iran starts, and vice versa? Now, what is really interesting, this parallels developments elsewhere. If you look at the European history, at the exact same year, with the Treaty of Augsburg, the Catholic and Protestants for the first time recognized each other. So you look from kind of the big picture, this is not something that is going on only between Iran and the Ottoman Empire. It is part of an intercontinental development in Eurasia, right? Now, there are differences between Amasya and, of course, the Treaty of Augsburg, but in essence, they are very, very similar. Now, of course, having a treaty doesn't mean that you will not have other wars. About 20 years after the Treaty of Amasya, Safavids and Ottomans went through the most violent part of their history in my mind. The wars over the Caucasus. When you read the Ottoman chronicles of time, it's really mind-boggling. How they made heaps of skulls that one of the chronicles, Tarihi Osman Pasha calls, it causes one to lose their mind looking at those towers of the skulls that they were built. So the wars over Caucasus are really, really ferocious. Now what happened after the wars of Caucasus? They made treaties. The first one is Treaty of Amasya, sorry, not Amasya, Istanbul. And the agreement refers to what is called Süleyman's Sınır. And for the first time, in 1590, it made provisions for appointment of diplomats who in certain parts of the boundary will go and talk to people and ask them where the boundary is. So we are seeing closely, right, leaving the religio-ideological border behind and slow formation of a geopolitical boundary between those two powers. And the terms they use are called Kat-ı Hudud ve Men-i Sudud. Kat-ı Hudud is defining the boundary, Men-i Sudud is preventing intervention in each other's affairs. Now, of course, they had two other treaties after that. I will not go over them, and war. But when Shah Abbas, of course, took the reign, he took advantage of Ottomans going through some internal revolts, and then he pushed the pendulum, that is the borders, westward. So all other treaties that were done, 3 of them, right, they were thrown out of the window. So we have a new border. Let me see if I can show you kind of the time of those treaties. So Shah Abbas's wars, of course, again devastated the borderland communities, and the parties came together. Again, the debate was Kat-ı Sınır ve Tayin-i Sugor. This process culminated in what Ottoman chronicles called Nasuh Pasha Treaty of 1618, and then, as you can see, there will be another treaty, Treaty of Serab in 1618. Now, what happens, of course, these treaties did not end the fluidity of the borders. When a less resourceful ruler replaced Abbas, it was the Ottomans' turn to push the pendulum eastward this time. And immediately, the Ottoman chronicles start referring the Ottoman Sultan as Caliph of the world, and Iranians are now Mulhid, Rafidi, Qızılbaş Khanzır, and most importantly, of course, Mushrikun, whose killing was justified by Quranic injunctions. Now, despite such discursive bragging, Ottomans failed to expand their frontiers in the north, but were able to capture Baghdad, and this came at the heel of 16 years of war. And the treaty that was signed, Treaty of Zohab or Kasr-i-Shirin, one of the versions of the treaty is called Sınırname, like the frontier document, showing you that that is the essence of the fight. And it emphasized that the treaty's purpose was to delimit frontiers and boundaries. Tayini ahvali sınır ve hudud. Now, the 1639 treaty did not establish a precise line. In some parts it did, but in other parts it says, for example, Basra belongs to the Ottomans. We do not know exactly where Basra starts or where Basra ends. In some parts it refers to tribes, the Jaf tribe of the Kurdish tribe. One part of it will be Ottoman, the other part will be Iran. Right? So what this tells us that the local sensibilities were also very important. Like when it comes to the end of the frontier, one thing that people, despite anti-Arab nationalism in Iran, Iran actually got its most important, I will say the most important part of its land, Abadan, thanks to an Arab tribe because it was Shia deciding to side with Iran. So local sensibilities play a very significant role in this. And the agency of local people is very important in deciding the borders. Now, what is really interesting again about the Treaty of Qasr-Shirin, when you turn your gaze to Europe, you have another treaty 10 years later, very similar. Right? We have the Treaty of Westphalia, very much like Ottomans and Iranians who signed a treaty after 16 years of war. You have the Europeans now signing another treaty, Treaty of Westphalia, which becomes kind of the source of the state system that we are talking about today. Again, you see the transformation of territoriality is a global phenomenon which Ottomans and Iranians are taking part in. Right? It's not very different. Now, the Treaty of Zohab did not lay down a precise boundary, but it brought a relatively long peace to the Ottoman-Iran relations. Now, historians will tell you this is not because they didn't want to expand their borders, but because both parties were actually very busy internally. Now, how do we know this? Because the moment of Safavid destruction, when it came, Ottomans immediately jumped on the opportunity. They issued the same fatwas, and Ahmed III sent orders to his commanders, repeating exactly what Mufti Sarugores, Hamza Sarugores in 1512, or Kemal Pashazad, or Abu Suud, all those Shaykh al-Islam said, and then he actually cites a whole collection of fatwas that we do not know about, that all of them declare Iranians to be kafir, mulhid, rafidi, and this and that. Killing them, taking their goods and children and wives is permissible. Right? This is 1722. Now, those are, of course, today we call them takfiri fatwas, and they all were takfiri fatwas. And again, when you look from the question I started with, Iran's place in the idea of the Ottomans, when opportunity arises, shifts. Iran goes very easily from Dar al-Islam to Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Shia, which is worse than Dar al-Harb. Right? Now, this ambiguity did not last long. Nader Shah came to power, defeated the Ottomans. Yes, sir. All right. We just at Nader Shah. We have to come to Nasruddin still. So Nader Shah forces the Ottomans to sign a treaty, and this is a very new development. Now, Charles Mayer, a historian, described the alliance that I'm talking about as the transformation of territoriality, in which a bounded territory and the control of populations within it increasingly became the premise of state sovereignty. In the Ottoman-Iranian borderland, as in Europe, this evolving premise of social organization emerged around the mid-17th century, 1639, 1648, experienced decisive modifications in the 18th century, Treaty of Cordon in 1746, and culminated in the 19th century when states successfully intensified efforts to territorialize, integrate, and reclaim space with the help of new technologies. The resulting contest between states for control over finite space and its inhabitants is the process of transformation of borderlands into boundaries. Now let me summarize what I'm going to say. So what happened? The borders did not settle, and the parties looked for opportunities. And when opportunity arose, two of the Iranian princes, Abbas Mirza and Dawlat Shah, both of them the governors of large frontier provinces, also rivals for the possible throne. When Ottomans were fighting with the Greeks, they immediately took the opportunity and tried to expand Iran's frontiers, which I call the pendulum, westward. And they did actually. Some of the disputed lands ever since been in Iranian hands. Now, one new development stopped the Iranians. That was cholera. Cholera emerged in Iranian ranks, killed Dawlat Shah, and ended the Iranian campaign. So this is a new actor, new global force, and it's indifferent to sectarian or national identities, and oblivious to geopolitical boundaries. This infectious and lethal bacterial disease heralded the advent of a novel frontier, the medical one. Now, all right, I want to bring another 5 more. I got that. Thank you, sir. So, what emerges with cholera? A new type of frontier, a medical frontier emerges. And what this medical frontier, part of the international order, 2 things. One, cholera. One is the dead bodies. Now, unlike anywhere else, I think the only other place that resembles this is, of course, Jerusalem, where the Jewish dead are buried at the Mount of Olives. So Iranian, Indian, Afghan, and Iraqi Shiites wanted to be buried in the holy Shia cities of Iraq, right? Like cemeteries like this one. Because they want to be resurrected before everybody else, because the Imam is there, right? The Imam is going to help them. Now, one of the issues is the corpse traffic. And what is really interesting, I want to show you some numbers, if I can. One more. Now, this is the number, if you can look at it, the number of cadavers coming and the number of pilgrims. Now, they are very different, but when you look at the money that the Ottomans were making from the 30,000 pilgrims and 5,000 cadavers is almost equal. So it was a very profitable trade for the Ottomans, those dead bodies. But the problem is their very existence. And this is the time that cholera is emerging all over the world. And by 1850, we have the beginnings of the World Health Organization, sanitary conferences. The first one in 1851 convenes in Paris. The second one the third one actually will be convened in Istanbul. And the question is what to do. Are dead bodies carriers of disease? So the Ottoman Empire, that was declared as the sick man of Europe, now had to take measures so that Europe will not get sick. And pressure was put on Egypt, Iran, and Ottomans to actually control their borders. And the dead bodies became a conduit of modernity, right? Forcing the Ottomans and Iranians to obey by the new health regime that is emerging in the world. So before having a boundary, Ottomans start establishing a cordon sanitaire, and telegraph was mentioned a lot today. Telegraph stations will also become quarantine stations where Iranians will have to wait. Now what happens, the Ottomans will now require identity cards from the Iranians, dead or alive. In 1871, Midhat Pasha, the foremost reformer in the Ottoman Empire, and Sepeh Salar from Iran, they come together, they say, okay, the Iranians could be buried in Iraq. But before you come to be buried, you have to be buried for 3 years, your bones have to be dried, and then be brought to Iraq. And there's this very famous kind of anecdote I use in one of my articles. This gentleman he's a very poor gentleman, brings his father's bones in a bag of barley, pretending to feed his animal. And Ottomans caught him, because it's a very profitable trade. So what this did, the dead bodies forced the Ottomans and Iranians to come with regulations to limit the crossing of the living bodies. And the medical regime that appeared all over the world forced them to come together. So what they did, and what the British and Russians actually forced them to do, because they were going to have another war in 1841. Britain and Russia came in and they said, enough. We have to decide where your borders are. A frontier commission or congress was convened in the city of Erzurum in modern-day Turkey. It lasted for 3 years. After that frontier commission or congress, then there was a survey commission that worked for another 3 years. That's 6 years of work trying to figure out where the boundary is. They collected information, and sorry, let me see if I go. they said, okay, we'll have to make a map of this boundary, and I'm very badly summarizing this whole process that I wrote a book about. They said, okay, we will finish the map of the border in 6 months. There was, of course, Crimean War and other things. It took them 12 years to make the map of the border. And this is what they come up with. They could not find where exactly the border that was supposed to exist for 350 years is. And if you look at here, so this is, the Ottoman says the border is here, Iranians say the border is here, the mediating commission says no, the border is here. And this, of course, did not end the debate. Iranians and Ottomans are not accepting each other's arguments. And they signed a treaty in 1847, but before that, what happened with the court traffic and Abbas Mirza and Daulat Shah, they signed another treaty called the First Erzurum Treaty, 1823. This is the first ever time that religion was not mentioned in Ottoman-Iran relations. When they signed the treaty, the Ottoman delegates, they went back, they looked at the treaty, they said, we did not mention Shia and Sunni Islam. How is this going to happen? Because it's an ideological framework. And then, after much discussion, they said, you know what, it's okay. So that's what I'm talking about secularization. So when Ataturk and Reza Shah came together, and we are hailed as the two secular kind of leaders, this is the legacy they are building on. This is the legacy that brought them together. It's a long period of transformation of the borders and secularization of international relations. But this did not end there. When they were going to go to another war, before the First World War, the British and Russian came in, and I'm about to finish. Good timing. Britain and Russia came in again, and they told them that now you have to have a border. Ottomans and Iranians agreed, but with one condition. Britain and Russia said, we've been mediating powers to try to limit this border. It did not work. Because Ottomans are, as you can see in this map, claiming parts of Iran. Iranians are claiming parts of the Ottoman Empire. They said, since for 70 years almost, we have been mediators, and this mediation did not work. We are going to be arbitrators. And they actually arbitrated the boundary between Iran and the Ottoman Empire. And a couple days before the beginning of the First World War, around Qajar, the Russian, British, Iranian, and Ottoman delegates finally finalized the border, but that was not the end of it. As we know, Turkey and Iran will exchange lands, and then we know what Saddam Hussein will do, and all. So a border that was supposed to be there for 400 years was not really there. It was somewhere, but it took a very long process of treaties and fights and international intervention to make it happen. And the dead bodies played a very significant role in bringing this to a reality. And I think I will cut that.